Doctoral candidates, I am pleased to introduce your commencement speaker, who is a pioneering scholar, a brilliant communicator, and Christiano. Professor Christiano is at the forefront of the emerging academic discipline surrounding public interest communications, which is broadly defined as communications that transcend the interest of any single individual or group and that serve the public good. Activists and advocates have long engaged in public interest communications to bring about needed social change, from the abolitionists who revealed the cruelty of slavery by putting up posters showing images of slave ships, to the public health leaders whose advertising campaigns helped to put smoking on the run. As the Frank Carroll Chair in Public Interest Communications in our university's College of Journalism and Communications and director of the newly established Center for Public Interest Communications, Ms. Christiano is developing the first ever curriculum in public interest communications. She's also launched and she leads the annual Frank Gathering, which brings hundreds of leaders of social causes from around the world here to Gainesville to meet with scholars and funders. In addition to these efforts, Professor Christiano works extensively in training scientists and academic leaders to communicate effectively about their research. Many of our researchers have, here at the University of Florida, benefited from her wise counsel. Ms. Christiano was also named the University of Florida Teacher of the Year in 2014. Before she came to UF in 2010, she was a senior communications officer for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and she earned her master's in public affairs and policy from Rutgers University and her BA in public relations from the University of Maryland. Would you please join me in welcoming Professor Ann Christiano.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Fox. Good morning. Today, we're here to celebrate you and your commitment to scholarship. You've honed your ability to ask big questions and find their answers. You've trained like athletes in the discipline of curiosity. Today, I call on you to take that a step further. I want you to become virtuosos of curiosity. When I think of virtuosos, I think of my idol Alessandra Ferri, who was a prima ballerina at the Royal Ballet. She was world famous. She was the best in the world. And yet, she decided that she hadn't achieved her best. So she left the Royal Ballet and went to American Ballet Theater to push herself even further to the top of her potential. As you watch her, you feel Juliet's passion for Romeo. She's extraordinarily proficient technically, but she's as gifted as a storyteller as she is a dancer. And today, we honor another virtuoso who created dozens of iconic moments of her own. Ms. Rivera, I grew up in a ballet studio, and I have idolized you, and I never imagined in my craziest aspirations that I'd get to be on stage with you. But here it is, it's happened, and we're both wearing really unflattering dresses. When I think of virtuosos, I also think of Kev Marcus and Will B of the duo Black Violin. Let me show you why I love them. Aren't they amazing? They're classically trained artists who grew up in Fort Lauderdale, and they merged their music with hip hop for a sound that's obviously not like anything else, and they transcended their art form. They used their music to overcome stereotypes and the discrimination that they faced. And Kev said about those stereotypes, he said, I'm kind of glad for it, because it gives me a goal for something to try and debunk. So the term virtuoso is often associated with these kinds of brilliant performances, but what we often forget is that virtuoso can also be used to describe an experimenter or investigator, particularly in the arts or sciences. Let me introduce you to another virtuoso, Nikolai Vavilov, a Russian geneticist and botanist. He grew up amidst famine and was certain that the end to world hunger lay in finding and protecting seed and plant types that could thrive under a range of conditions. He made expeditions to 64 countries, learning countless languages along the way to aid in his discovery. Under his leadership, the Vavilov Research Institute of Plant Industry acquired millions of specimens. But when Stalin came to power, he supported those without scientific training, including a pseudoscientist named Lysenko. Vavilov was thrown into the Gulag, where, ironically, this brilliant scientist who had devoted his life's work to ending famine died of starvation just 2 years into his 20-year sentence. But his legacy doesn't end there. In the summer of 1941, German troops entered Russia, and by September, Leningrad was under siege. Scientists at the Plant Institute knew they had to protect those seeds from the Germans and from their starving countrymen. They barricaded themselves into the Institute, taking turns to protect the seeds from the Germans, their fellow Russians, each other, and an infestation of rats. The German siege wore on for more than 3 years. 800,000 Russians died, and as food sources inside the Institute dried up, the scientists were faced with a terrible decision. They could eat the seeds and roots they had worked so hard to collect and preserve, or they could die of starvation. You know what they chose. The Institute remains, and the seeds they gave their lives to protect, and it is still one of the largest of the 6,000 seed banks in the world. You might argue that, like those plant geneticists and botanists who died so heroically, science is still under siege. A recent paper from the Pew Research Center shows that only 40% of Americans report strong trust in scientists. And in March, researchers at MIT published a study showing that on Twitter, fake news can travel as much as 6 times faster than the truth. It feels like scientific inquiry and the truth itself is under threat. Today, the stakes may be different than those scientists faced during the dark days of the siege in Leningrad. They're no less important. There's a narrative that scientists are not good communicators, that they're content to tuck their work away in journals and share it at sparsely attended academic conference sessions, that they're counseled not to invest their time in working with the news media because they'll be misunderstood or misquoted, or they won't ever make it into the National Academies of Science. I don't know where this narrative originated, but I don't believe it. There's too much evidence to the contrary. Science is filled with virtuosos who shared their stories and challenged themselves to engage people in their work who don't share their expertise. Einstein was certainly one of them. He was, of course, a brilliant physicist who changed our understanding of time, but he was also goofy and kind. I love this picture of him in his fuzzy slippers on the front porch of his home on Mercer Street in Princeton. He's quoted as telling a new mom that the surest way to guarantee her child's intellect was to read him fairy tales. When she asked, "But what else?" he said, "More fairy tales." As a lover of stories and storytelling, I couldn't agree more. And Lisa Scott, an associate professor in UF psychology department, who's here today, sitting in the front row, has the science to back Einstein up. She studies infant brain development and learning, and her research shows that reading particular kinds of stories at specific stages of development can improve babies' cognition. That's her daughter in her lab. Isn't she cute? I love her face. She's like, "What?" Lisa had published her work in several academic journals, but she wanted to get it to parents. And how would that have happened? Would some early childhood educator done a lit review of great stories to read at the right ages and eventually developed a curriculum that used Lisa's research? That could have taken years. It may not even have ever happened. So Lisa knew she had to take efforts into her own hands. But her previous efforts working with the news media hadn't gone that well, and so she decided to write an article for The Conversation, which is a news site that uses academics as reporters and journalists as editors, and provides opportunities for academics to share research with non-expert audiences. Her article got picked up in dozens of publications, and as of today, it has hundreds of thousands of reads. It appeared in the Washington Post, Scientific American, and most importantly, for her goal to reach parents, her study got covered in Parents magazine. Oh, and for those of you who are parents are like, tell me what the revelation is, what am I supposed to read? Books with characters with names. You're welcome. David Parvati is an associate professor here at UF in civil and coastal engineering. He's a structural engineer who's passionate about buildings, and he studies how strong our houses are in the face of major wind events like hurricanes and tornadoes. Recently, he showed me an image of a neighborhood surrounding a school in Moore, Oklahoma, taken from the air days before a tornado hit. He showed me a second photo taken after the tornado. 40% of the buildings in the tornado's path were leveled. And he looked at me and he said, what's so frustrating to me about this is I had published a paper about how those buildings could have been more resilient just a few years earlier. It would have saved so many of those houses in that community. And he said, that's not even the thing that frustrates me most. And then he showed me a paper of his from the 1990s that showed pretty much the same thing. And then another one from a different scholar that had been published in the 1970s on a similar topic. And then one in 1968. And the worst of all, one that had been published 121 years ago. He held up his hands and he was just frustrated and shaking his head, and he said, we know these things. This knowledge isn't making its way from the journals into the design plans of builders. We have known for more than 100 years how to prevent this kind of damage. And with that, he said, I can't just keep turning out more research papers. I have to be an advocate for the truth. Today, in addition to continuing his research, David is developing an app that will help home buyers better evaluate their homes for resilience and make minor modifications that could actually save their lives and their livelihoods. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Andy Selpak, whose office is just down the hall from mine in the College of Journalism and Communications, was telling me one day about how he wanted to spend more time talking with the news media about media effects. But when he started down that path, some of his senior colleagues discouraged him. They told him he might be misquoted or his comments could be used out of context. And you know what he said? He said, and what would they do with my silence? The world requires more of you than to be great in your discipline and communicate with your peers. Each of the virtuosos I told you about today stepped out of their path to push themselves not simply to the top of their field, but to the top of their potential. For each of them, becoming a virtuoso required them to become great storytellers who opened themselves to new opportunities and shared those opportunities with others. They didn't just tell better stories, they became them. The path to becoming the best version of yourself isn't straight and it isn't obvious, and you're on a quest and a magnificent one. You can choose to be like Alessandra Ferri or Kevin Will or Ms. Rivera or Lisa Scott or David Previtt or Andy Selpak. Maybe you're Vavilov traveling the world to collect and add to a massive collection of seeds that will protect our future, or like the scientists sacrificing to make the world a better place. You are the story. Be a story whose plot twists fascinate others and inspire them to find their own. That takes transparency and honesty and a willingness to let others see your flaws and your failures. What does that mean on a practical level? It means that you're required to explain why your quest matters to people who are not experts. Enter their worlds. Don't expect them to come to ours. Why does it matter so much that we should take these precious moments on your day of triumph and celebration? I'm not sharing these stories as advice for a brilliant career or a happy life. The world requires the truth that only you can find and share. Scholarship and science can bring us back to the truth and our best selves as humans in a pluralistic society. If you do this, you will clear the path into the ranks of Virtuoso. And when you do, you will ignite others with your passion. You will make others' faith in the Academy burn brighter. Who better than the Virtuosos of curiosity to lead us to the truth, who will make us all our best selves? Who better than you? Thank you.